And so if that's the case, we don't need to have some crazy claim. All we need to ask is, what is the chance of all of these data that we find from history being exactly the same if this event never happened? And what you find out, and what Richard Swinburne has done, it is so mathematically improbable. You are actually rationally allowed to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. It's really cool. It's called Bayesian theory. I don't have time to get into that, but he has a whole sort of lecture on that. But secondly, I don't think we have the possibility of knowing possibilities when it comes to God in this sense of miracles. Let me read what Dr. Moreland has here, and he has a brilliant insight on this. He goes, given that God exists and is a person, the one way we can say that given a miracle or miracles in general are improbable and extremely unlikely is to know God's mind. This is what he's saying. Look what the blue says. Just because we see less miracles in our everyday life than the amount happening, it doesn't follow that this event of being miraculous is any less probable because we don't know God's mind. We are bringing in a supernatural being who has freedom of will. It could be the case that given certain circumstances, God will always act in it, not making the miracle highly improbable, but making it certain. If God is free, and he has a mind, and he has a will, and he has a plan, and we don't know all of the facts behind it, how are we to conclude that this event was less likely to happen than not? And I don't think we are in the position to make these probability claims, given that God is a free being and has a will. Seeing just through these two arguments, not only is it we got to know what extraordinary means, and a lot of times it's begging the question, also with miscalculated probability, as well as not knowing God's necessarily knowing his mind and what he would do in every circumstances, I don't think we need to be afraid of this argument. In fact, I don't think it works at all. So lastly, David Hume. David Hume's arguments, and there's two major versions of David Hume's arguments that I want to present today. And Dr. Norman Geisler points these out perfectly. And the first argument that he's going to give is for the impossibility of miracles. This is what he says. He goes, let me define a miracle for you. He goes, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Anyone already see problems with this? Yep. Okay. Miracles is a violation of the laws of nature. Firm and unalterable experience has established these laws. A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Therefore, the proof against a miracle is as entire as an argument from experience can possibly be imagined. This is what he's saying. Miracles are a violation of nature. We know that nature can't be violated. And so anything that looks like a miracle, a wise man portions his belief to what is regular. Therefore, we should never believe that a miracle is even possible to happen. You can already see the problems with this. First, his arguments are based on presuppositions and actually circular in reasoning. Hume defines a miracle as a violation of the law of nature, and then goes to define the law of nature as principles that can't be violated. That's not helpful. Miracles are a violation in nature, and nature can't be violated. Well, you can't just say that. You have to prove that, right? So he defined in his own argument the impossibility without proving anything. He goes, he is ruling out the possibility of miracles at the outset. He is assuming that which he has already stated he will prove. And lastly, this is an assertion, not an argument. I need you to prove your premises. What he is saying is that miracles violate the principle that miracles never happen. Well, that's not helpful. But what's really interesting is Hume realized he did this circular reasoning. In his own writing, he goes, okay, I got to fix what I've done. And so what he's done is he's corrected his argument to try to argue that, okay, maybe they're not impossible, but maybe we should never believe any evidence. Say someone brings us evidence. And so here's the argument that he points out here. 1, a miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. 2, Natural law is by definition a description of what is regular. And the evidence for what is regular is always greater for what is rare, right? 3, a wise man bases his belief on the greatest evidence. Therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. Miracles are very rare. Laws of nature are very common. A wise man portions his belief to what is common, so we should always believe that something in nature is happening and shouldn't believe in miracles. There are problems with this. Let me give you 3 of the major ones. The first problem is the massive assumption of uniform experience. This seems to either beg the question or is special pleading. He made some logical fallacies in this. It begs the question if Hume presumes to know the whole field of experience to be uniform in advance without even looking at the evidence. Now, I don't know about you. Look at my fact here. According to the National Survey, roughly 94 million adults in the U.S. would say they had experience that they could only explain as a miracle from God. Now, this is not to say it was a miracle, but this is to say they thought it was a miracle. And so to say that all uniform experiences is not to experience the rare things that people can't explain. The National Survey shows this to be wrong. If you want to say all of human experience is uniform, you have to deal with these incredible claims from China, in Africa, in the Islamic world. You have to show all of these are false to first say everything is uniform in experience. Secondly, it's special pleading. Special pleading is basically you take a small group and make it like the sum total of everything. And so if he means that by uniform, he selected a group of people, like his peers and his scholars, and then just say, this is how it works for everyone, well, that's just garbage. That's special pleading. You can't just say, well, all my friends don't experience, therefore everything's uniform. That doesn't work like that. As you've just seen, it just doesn't work like that. I love what C.S. Lewis says, specifically addressing Hume. He says, unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all reports of them to be false. He only said they're uniform if we know all reports to be false. He's assuming they're false in order to argue they're uniform without proving they're false. Secondly, he does something what is called adding evidence versus weighing evidence. And just look at the blue for now. Hume's argument equated quantity of evidence and probability. It says, in effect, that we should always believe what is most probable. We should always believe what is most probable. But this is silly. On these grounds, a dice player should not believe that dice showed 3 6s on the first roll, since the odds are 216 to 1. We should not believe that we won the lottery on the news report if you want to talk about improbabilities. But no, that's not what we do. We don't weigh evidence, right? Well, we don't add evidence, we weigh evidence. What Hume seems to forget is that wise people base their belief on facts, not odds. He confuses quantity of evidence with quality of evidence. You might have a ton of evidence, and it be garbage. And I have a lot less, but being unbelievable evidence. I would never hold to a principle that says I need to reject the good evidence because there's a ton of just garbage arguments out there. Why would you do that? And lastly, Hume is a naturalist. He is an atheist from the outset. And he fundamentally argues naturalistic assumptions in his writing. Hume assumes metaphysical naturalism to make his arguments. If he would assume theism, then all of his arguments would crumble, right? Look what Dr. Burns writes about it after researching Hume. Hume appears to have tried to persuade readers to stop believing miracles without the courtesy of first seeking to dissuade them of their atheism. Hume tries to persuade people to stop believing it without first trying to prove theism wrong. Let me read you some of these quotes. Dr. Richard Swinburne. If there is no God, then the laws of nature are ultimately determinants of what happened. But if there is a God, then whether and for how long and under what circumstances laws of nature operate depend on them. C.S. Lewis. If we admit God, we must admit a miracle. Indeed, we have no security against it. That is the bargain. Dr. Ahlstein writes, Thus, knowledge of how nature normally works tells us nothing about how events might occur if a supernatural entity were to intervene. St. Augustine writes this: miracles don't appear contrary to nature from God's point of view. For God, nature is whatever he wants it to be. One violates a law which one is subject to. Someone would have to begin by arguing that on theism, God is necessarily subject to all of the laws that he has created. And John Stuart Mill, who is an atheist, he writes this against Hume. All Hume has accomplished was to show that if we already don't believe in supernatural, if we already don't believe in God, then nothing can prove as a miracle to us. If we don't believe in God, then there's no evidence that can prove a miracle. Hume has assumed that God doesn't exist. Well, if God doesn't exist, of course he can't do anything because he doesn't exist. But if God's in the equation, a lot of things are possible. And Hume takes this fundamental naturalistic assumption in his argument. Now, arguments against miracles, our inability to know through history, and miracles that happen with us, you know what? Doesn't work. Scientific studies, guess what? Don't work. The extraordinary evidence argument, guess what? Doesn't work. And Hume's argument, guess what? Also doesn't work. So lucky for us, remember I talked about the first slide. What's at stake? And I looked at that argument. We can reject premise 3, that miracles are impossible. And if that's the case, a lot of things open up for us. That God is still working. And then the purposes that we've taken a look in the first part are still ongoing. And when we come back from a 10-minute break, what I want to do is I want to soak in miracles. And I want to read you some miracle stories that were recorded in journals and by doctors on their charts and explain to you some of the things that they have witnessed. So it can dwell in us, let us rest on our minds and our hearts and train ourselves to be more expectant. So we have what is a miracle, what are the purposes, and arguments against them do not work. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we will come back and finish off the talk. We are back from our break. For those who aren't here, you missed out on Paula's Donuts. Paula's Donuts and coffee, that is your fault that you missed out on Paula's Donuts. They can take some home with them too. It's just, you can't take it home if you're not here. But we are back from the break. We took a look at, in the first half, what is the purpose of miracles and what's a good working definition of what the miraculous is, as well as we took a look at 4 of the major arguments against miracles existing and their possibility. And we saw that these arguments do not work against miracles actually happening. So in this half, what I want to do is I want to take a look at the miracle stories. I really want to soak in the miraculous and read some of these stories, my research that I have found. And then afterwards, I want to ask the question, what if miracles don't happen? What if miracles don't happen? Now, I do want to say this. If you guys are looking for a good source, Dr. Craig Keener has a 2-volume, 1,400-page book, 2 books on it, on miracles and his investigation and looking at the journals and his conversations, and he's footnoted every single thing. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of examples that he personally sought out and investigated himself. So if you're looking for more examples and to read more about them, I suggest reading some of his volumes on the work, because some of them are insane, what he's discovered in the medical journals. But before I start reading some of these examples, Dr. J.P. Moreland, in his book, Experiencing Miracles, gives us 7 points how we can create habits to be more expectant for the miraculous in our lives. And I want to read some of these points for you, because I think these are good to consider throughout our daily lives and create habits and train ourselves in order to be more expectant for God to use you in ways that maybe you didn't think was possible before. So the first one he says is this: doubt your doubts. Doubt your doubts. Face your intellectual doubts honestly. A lot of people, when they get doubts in their mind, they think like these things are going to drown them. And I get it. I've been through life where I've doubted, and it made me nervous. But he points out it's okay to doubt those doubts. And when you have doubts, he says, test them. Put them through the fire. Drag them through the mud. See if they hold, because you're going to find if Christianity is true, those doubts will not stand. Doubt your doubts. Face your doubts intellectually. Second, he says, make a habit to ask others about what they've heard and seen. Ask people, hey, did you experience anything in your life? Have you seen anything? Tell me more about these things. I want to soak my lives in examples from people who I trust and I know who are credible and can tell me these stories. Third, talk with church leadership about sharing more testimonies from the pulpit about the miraculous that they have seen or heard. I think in our church we could be doing better at this. Sharing stories, sharing testimonies here and there. I'm not saying create a church solely around that. You end up getting some interesting churches if this is the case, but it doesn't hurt to have this every once in a while. Fourth, he says, avoid both extremes, gullibility and skepticism. We can't believe everything that's out there. We can't be skeptical about everything. Harm can be done to the cause of Christ if we believe everything, and harm can be done if we don't believe anything. So we should take everything on a case-by-case basis and do our intellectual duty and investigate these things. Fifth, he says, be honest about your disappointment with God. If something doesn't happen for your life and you ask for it, be honest with him. He's okay. He's big enough. He's tough enough. He's strong enough. He can take some blows. Trust me, there are some really interesting people throughout history who are Christians that have gone after God in their hearts. He can handle it. 6, read a good book that gives reasons for how we know God exists. Just as we saw in the very last thing, if God is in the equation, as C.S. Lewis says, there's nothing you can defend against the miraculous happening. Boost yourself on the knowledge of God's existence and God's works in creation to know that if he exists, he is still working in this way. And 7th, read a good book about researched miraculous claims. And do you know what I've done? I've done that. And I want to share some of them with you. I want to take a few minutes to soak you in some of these examples that I really thought were cool and really sort of made me go, oof, that's incredible. From peer-reviewed and the doctor's reports, let me read you some of this. Deborah Watson's sister, her name was Gloria. And when Gloria was a young baby, she fell off a high-perched bassinet onto the hard floor. As she lay there motionless, her father, who was a pastor, his name was James, he realized the back of her skull was fractured and was crunching in his hand as he picked up his daughter. So he realized they could get to the hospital before the ambulance got to them and got back to the hospital. So him and his wife prayed a whole entire way, rushed into the emergency room. The nurses, seeing what has happened, rushed the daughter back into surgery as the parents wait in the waiting room praying for their daughter. All of a sudden, the doctors came out to meet their parents, and they're, how is she? The doctor goes, I don't know what's wrong with her. And they go, what do you mean? I don't know what's wrong with her. The nurses who took the daughter in came out to the parents and go, what happened? Because her daughter's back of the head was as if nothing happened at all. An hour later, they took the daughter home, and to this day, nothing was wrong with her head, and she continues to be perfectly fine. From thousands of pieces of fractured skull recorded by the nurses in her charts to absolutely nothing when the doctors came into her, recorded in their medical journal. Crazy. Dr. McLennan, he actually has a record that he shared with Dr. Keener of 60 events that he has seen and experienced. This is what Dr. McLennan shares. He had a woman who had severe uterine cancer for many years. After many, many tests throughout the years, they finally got her prepped and ready for surgery. And the night before, she stayed in the hospital because surgery was going to be first thing in the morning. But randomly, late at night, some really weird woman, an unexpected guest, walked into her room. She was very confused because she was expecting no guest. She wondered why the hospital would allow anyone this late if even it was a guest, and let alone being some random stranger who she has never met. The stranger came over and just prayed for the woman and then left. The woman felt a warm sensation come over her entire body. Now, a quick side note. I can't tell you how many of these miracle stories I've read that they felt warm sensations during the event of the prayer or something. It's a very high amount of them. I would say over 60% of them experience this feeling from what the reports I have read. So in the morning, the woman was being prepped for surgery, and she kept telling the nurses, I want a test again. I don't want the surgery. I'm healed. I'm perfectly fine. And so the doctors, after being stubborn and finally they appeased the woman, right? And guess what they found? Her uterus was completely empty of cancer. And they let her go the next morning, cancer-free, and to this day, she still doesn't have cancer. Dr., I'm going to butcher this name, Sheepa case records of a woman named Kelly Craybaugh who had TMJ. And TMJ is basically a joint syndrome that locks all your joints. And she has had this since the age of 13, and at 16, her jaw locked for 6 months straight, and she had to go in and get surgery on her jaw just to open it. She was being fed through a liquid for those 6 months. But after her surgery, a few months later, the problem came back, and her joints locked up and her jaw locked up. Her Christian friends who lived in Sweden felt so bad for her, decided, feeling the call to come fly to America and pray over her friend. During her prayer, her jaw immediately opened. The next day, they took her to the doctor to see what is happening. And the diagnosis of TMJ was if it never happened in the first place. The syndrome completely gone. Pastor Donald Bartow records of an elderly person who he prayed for in the hospital, who was diagnosed with a rare skin disease which he had had for 2/3 of his entire life. He was covered with itching and seeping boils and terrible rashes. In the hospital, Pastor Donald Bartlaw anointed this man with oil and prayed for his healing. As soon as he left the room, the doctors came in, and guess what? All the rashes, the seeping boils, completely gone after the prayer. The doctors found the man sitting up, awake in bed, ready to be released. Dr. Klaus records the story, which you can find in Juliet, Illinois newspaper, of a 10-year-old girl who had Ray's syndrome. She was in a coma on a bed of ice with a shunt in her brain to relieve pressure. Doctors gave her 48 hours. And now, a Wheaton student in college heard of this woman in the news and felt compelled to travel out there and pray over this little girl with Ray's syndrome. So the student met her at the hospital. The parents allowed her in. And as soon as the student left and the doctors came in, the woman was awake out of her coma, perfectly new. They removed the shunt 10 days later, and the little girl walked out of it completely clear. Her Ray's syndrome completely gone. Next story is located in the Family Medical Journal of a man named Gene Wilkins who was diagnosed at age 17 with rheumatoid arthritis as a juvenile. By his mid-20s, his body was in complete pain, and when there was cold outside, he literally could do nothing but stay home in pain. That's how bad his arthritis was. But he was a Christian, he loved God, and whenever he could go to church, he could go to church. Until this elderly woman named Edith, who he didn't know, randomly came up and said, "Can I lay hands on you and pray for you?" Well, Gene thought she was a weirdo and thought, I don't want this girl shouting in tongues at me, so I'm going to let her pray, but I'm going to have you just sit next to me. And so Edith agreed and prayed for Gene. Gene, during the prayer, felt a warm sensation over his body, and all of the pain just seemed to disappear. Now, he thought the pain was replaced by anxiety because of how strange this woman was, but he noticed after a few days, none of his pain was there. And so he went to check up, and his doctor, who diagnosed him for many years, came back into the room and basically said, "I think I might have gotten your diagnosis wrong." He goes, "What do you mean?" He goes, "You don't have anything." It's as if you never had anything. Completely clear after this woman in church prayed for her. According to St. Louis Review, Brieg McKenna had suffered for years of severe rheumatoid arthritis that had deformed feet and hands. She went on a church Christmas retreat, and she had people pray over her. Instantly, her sores, stiffness, and pain disappeared, and her feet and hands were as if they were never deformed. Here's the extra detail for the story. As they were praying for her, it was as if, do you ever seen the movies where someone's arms are cracking back into place? That was the testimony of the people that were there. As if her hands are crooked, and all of a sudden it did this during the prayer. Snapped back into place. During the prayer. And guess what? Diagnosis was as if it was never there in the first place. Let me give you a few more. Dr. Harris records, a person dying of kidney failure was instantly healed during prayer. Dr. Wimber records, a girl who had a wandering eye and bedwetting and an open spine, instantaneously everything was made perfect when someone prayed over her. Dr. Stewart records, a hand whose tendon has been cut was immediately healed and able to move after one of her family left for prayer. Dr. Bennett records, a person's eyesight was healed so that she could no longer even see properly through her glasses. That would be fantastic. Dr. Beadley records, although doctors told the family Baptist minister in a coma that he could not survive, he recovered after Jesus appeared to him in a vision and said, "You will be healed." A vision, Jesus appeared and said, "Healed." Boom. Immediately healed. Let me read you two more before I go to the next section, because there's tens of thousands of these. A patient, according to Dr. Harris, a patient who has been dying after surgical removal of his stomach experienced both the recovery and formation of a new stomach after the family prayed. Recorded. Medical recorded. And one more by Dr. Harris, he records. A severely burned young man close to death was healed, even of severe burns that should have left him virtually faceless. Third-degree burns everywhere. Family came in, prayed. Doctors came in. Everything was gone. Face, back to normal. Released. And we have tens and tens and tens of thousands of these examples of God doing wonderful things through his people for his people. And it's because we are experiencing a foretaste of something better that's coming. We weren't designed to be hurt and in pain like this. This was not his original intention. And one day, he is going to bring us and make us new, and we're tasting of it in the here and now. And he is still active. Now, this begs the question, what happens when miracles don't happen? What happens when we pray and they don't happen? And I think there's two categories I want to kind of go over with this. The first is, what are we to believe when we pray for miracles and we don't receive them? And secondly, I always hear this, why does the West seem so quiet? I don't think that's true. I think there's reasons why we don't often experience, but I don't think it's as quiet as you guys think it is. Because we always hear that common phrase. But let's talk about the first one. What are we to believe when miracles are not received? And the first thing I want to point out is a common thing I have heard, and I don't think we should think this way. And I think it plays everything into who we think the character of God is. And tell me if you've heard this before. If I was God, I would have done that miracle. I would have saved that person from cancer. Well, I think there's a problem with that. The way I understand God is he's perfect, good, loving. He's working all things. He knows. He's at a spot of knowledge of how things work and intermingle that I am not in a position to be. He is perfect in knowledge in his actions. And if we view God as this perfect being, if you were that perfect being, I would argue you would do the same thing as God. It's not that you would know better than God, because we are not in a position to know better than he does. And secondly, I think it's helpful to distinguish between two things. Meaningful suffering and inscrutable suffering. Meaningless suffering and inscrutable suffering. Meaningless suffering is when it doesn't achieve a greater good. A lot of people think that nothing good can come from this. As someone who believes Paul in Romans 8, I believe that even when things seem terrible, God has known and is working things towards his end good for those who love him. But if we believe that a lot of our suffering happens even when God allows things to continue, that there's inscrutable suffering, that we can believe that though we don't know the purpose, we have a reason to believe he is providential, loving, and all-powerful. And that all plays into how we understand who God is and how he works in our life. Miracles are a sign of God's love, a foretaste of the future. But we also need to know, lastly, that the Gospels also recount the message of the cross. Keener writes this, when God seems silent in the faces of our pain, God is at work even there. Indeed, especially there, because an empty tomb declares that the cross is not the final word. Even if we don't get our healing now, for those in Christ, we will. And that's what the miracles are showing us today. It's a foretaste. We're seeing that this future is possible for God. We can trust and have confidence that even though we might not know, one day we will be healed. And that God is providential and all-loving and all-powerful. And if we don't get it now, we can trust that He is on the throne, and one day we will. And lastly, when miracles don't happen, we always say, why does the West seem so quiet? Now, once you've in this research, I came to the conclusion that I don't think that's true. Studying the examples and studying the medical journals, and a lot of these scholars who investigated these reports and seeing some of the photos and reading these articles, I think God is more active than we give Him credit for. And if that's the case, I also think that begs that we need to be more expectant when it comes to miraculous things in our life. But I do think there are things that get in our way that harm our belief and trust and faith that God will act on our account. And I want to give you a handful of them. And once we can grasp them, I think it allows us to create habits and form in us certain strategies to sort of think in the opposite way, to train ourselves to expect God to be more active in our own lives and look for Him. The first one is this. Statistically, right? Naturally fewer miracles occur in the U.S. than outside the U.S. because North America as a whole has only roughly 8% of the world's population. We hear a lot of these stories coming from Africa and China because they have a gigantic more of the world's population than we do. And so, of course, right, it would make sense mathematically if it was equal across the board, we'd be hearing more from them over there than here. Secondly, in the West, we have a very anti-natural mindset, which often renders them invisible to us because we grasp for other explanations. Since miracles are therefore less meaningful to us, they're also less likely to happen. Let me give you an example. In Africa, even if people are not Christians, they are extremely hyper believers in supernatural. You might believe in a cult, you might believe in some other belief, but they are expecting the supernatural to do things in the everyday at every moment. You read some of these missionary statements of these creepy stories of these events because over in worlds like that, every single thing is involved in the supernatural. And over in the West, we're more reluctant to believe, more of an anti-supernatural. We almost believe too much in the natural law where God is almost deist, where He's set out things and He takes His hands off, rather than God working and overseeing and doing things in everyday life, like we see these beliefs in foreign countries. Dr. Charles Kraft states this: in comparison to other societies, Americans in the North Atlantic people are naturalistic. Non-Western people are frequently concerned about the activities of supernatural beings. The wide-ranging supernaturalism of most of the societies of the world is absent for most of our people. Our focus is squarely on the natural world, and with little or no attention paid to the supernatural world. Third, I think it's less necessary for God to do miraculous events. Less necessary than in third world countries. Let me give you a few reasons. When natural means exist, God often works through them. In Joshua 5, manna stopped once the Israelites could eat the fruit of the land. God didn't keep throwing manna at them. He's like, you got land, right? You got crops. I've produced things for you in natural means that you can have my blessings for. Second, Jesus taught us to pray for our daily bread, but it is not unbelief to go out and earn a living. It's not. Paul was a tent maker. Jesus fed the crowd supernaturally when food was needed, but He told His disciples to go gather food afterwards. The next meals were already gathered, so no miracle was needed. How silly would it be for the disciples to throw out the food so Jesus could multiply the bread and the loaves and the fish again? That would be silly, right? Third, God can heal, but He also expects us to use common sense. He has provided me a job with health insurance so I can go to the doctors. It is no less a divine blessing and a gift. In order to understand how the healthcare insurance, look at some of the statistics just that we find in Africa. 2% of the world's doctors live in Africa. 200,000 women die in childbirth each year in Africa, and 9% of the children born die before the age of 5. They don't have the kind of health care that we do. We might be able to take a pill that stops a virus from killing us when in there they need some sort of miraculous event or this virus is going to kill them. We have means that God has blessed us for in this world and in the West. Another reason, many Christians today are embarrassed by miracle stories in the Bible, or they're embarrassed if they try and nothing comes from it. I would pray for this person, but I think it's going to look like God doesn't exist if nothing happens. But once again, that assumes that we took a look at some of the scientific studies that it's God's will that it's for to happen. It's perfectly fine to pray and nothing to happen. That doesn't mean God doesn't exist or isn't working. It just means that he didn't answer your prayer. So here's what I like to say. Pray on the way. Pray on the way in the ambulance. Go to the hospital, but pray the entire time. There's nothing wrong with that. As we saw in the first, they prayed as taking the child to the hospital, and as soon as the doctors rushed in, God performed the miracle. God performed the miracle in the hospital after they prayed on the way. Next, I think a lot of times our churches in the West have a false biblical understanding of the good news. And this is what I mean by that. I did a talk on what is the gospel. You can find it on Pastor Mike and I on Bradley's podcast of the Caffeinated Christian. And my whole point was this, that a lot of times here we take a part of the good news and proclaim it as the entirety, and we miss a lot of the good news that is actually happening in Scripture. And we have titled the gospel to some strict atonement theory, when in fact it's all of what Jesus is doing throughout reality. And if this is the case, and we see the good news as more of what Jesus is doing found in the story of Israel, right? All of his completion, rather than just like the strict atonement theory. Miracles are a part of the good news. He's still working. The gospel, the good news, miracles are included. And I think we should preach it and speak it and think that God working today is a part of the good news that we have. Next, many people follow what is called the Reformed tradition. And this brings on a view called cessationism with it. And there's two views in cessationism. I had a whole 12-slide argument for it that I had to get rid of because I'm already running over. But this view, basically, if you take a strong view, it believes that God is not doing any miracles, no speaking in tongues, no prophecies, nothing. That God is not active whatsoever. And a lot of people who hold to a very Reformed tradition hold this view. And like we saw in the STEP study, if you don't believe miracles are going to happen, how can you expect them when you're praying? And lastly, many Western churches set their minds almost strictly on the looks of Sunday morning. This leaves less time to dwell on these other specifics. A lot of churches are concerned of how they will look online or how to be presented on Sunday morning, and everything they do is geared to these few hours. But that takes up a lot of their brain space to not dwell on specific things like miracles, specific things on that we see in Scripture that God is specifically doing. And a lot of our focus is focused on the show rather than the dough, I guess you can say. So, we see that we can trust that God is active. We can have faith that even if we don't receive miracles, that they're not meaningless, but God is doing a purpose, and do not worry, because the gospel recounts the cross, and one day we will be healed. And God is active more than what we believe he is in the West here. And there are reasons why I think could hinder us in seeing this, that if we create good habits, it can open us up for more of God acting in and through us. So, miracles, purpose, argue against miracles. The West is not as quiet as you think. God is working. And so I have every belief that God is continuously to do his work in and among his people. if we are open and we are willing. So, before I close you out in prayer, I do want a quick announcement. Our next talk is on October 27th. It's a book study. Paul Copan, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. I'm going to be looking at a lot of agnostic and atheist claims through the book of how they sort of make fun of or scrutinize the Christian belief of the character of God in the Old Testament. And we're really going to dive deep in those arguments against us and these insults against us and really pull back the curtain on who God truly is in the Old Testament and bring out that He is a good God in everything that He is doing. So if you want to order this book, you can get it on Amazon. I think it's like $12 I got it for. It's an easy read. The chapters are 6 pages each, so you can read it 15 minutes, next day, 15 minutes the next day. And we are going to be going through the book, through the chapters, the content, and looking at it and breaking it apart. Yeah, if you don't read it, you can absolutely still come. You don't need to read the book to be here, because I will explain everything, what he said in the chapter, what was his purpose of the chapter, and we will walk step by step through it. So still come if you forgot to read it, because you are going to learn a lot about Old Testament law and what God is doing through their culture and His people. So if you could, bow your heads real fast, and I will pray us out. And I'm way over, so I'll go quick. Dear Lord, I just want to give you thanks for all you've done, Lord, and just thank you for continuing to work in our lives, to work in the lives of your church and showing a foretaste of what you have planned for us in the here and now, God. Please open our hearts and our minds to be less hard towards experiencing your work in and through your people, God. I ask for a blessing upon these people. Give them wisdom, give them discernment, and as they go out here, to continue just to look into who you are and your word and just pull away from it how wonderful you are. Lord, I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. And for those watching online, I appreciate you sticking with us the whole time, and hopefully you can make it here next time, or we're going to try to go live next time as well.